This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. When I was a little boy, I had this wonderful, very thick, very nicely illustrated book about world history. I absolutely loved it. I savored it. But there was one page that really bothered me. That was the first chapter on human evolution. I learned about words like Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus. And that was all well and good, but I didn't really feel like there was a story that I could relate to, that there was something in myself that I could learn about from looking at these half-human, half-ape creatures and memorizing their names. Now, somewhat surprisingly, I have very much invested myself in that very theme of human evolution. I've talked with a lot of experts on it, done a lot of episodes on it. And of course, I really, really believe that there's a lot that we can learn from it. But that first chapter in that lovely book from my childhood still haunted me a little bit. I came to realize that no matter how much I understood about the cutting-edge theories about specific aspects of human evolution, I did not feel like I really had a good overall picture of the 7 million years that took us from our common ancestor with chimpanzees to the modern Homo sapiens. And it is an episode that tries to remedy that. A lot has changed since the days that we talked about Homo habilis leading to Homo erectus leading to us. You won't even hear Homo habilis mentioned in this conversation. Homo erectus has been sidelined from our story to be an ape only living in Asia, not in Africa, where our story is taking place. And now, on the one hand, this is probably not very interesting. I mean, the names really don't matter that much. But the picture that we have nowadays is not only one with different terminology. It's one with much, much deeper lessons, much more interesting questions, I think, and really a lot of things that I have felt just fascinated and really stimulated by. And I'm really happy to share this episode with you. My guest is Dr. Ian Tattersall. He is a curator emeritus at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. He's both a leading thinker in human evolution as such, but also someone whose day job is to present these things to the general public. So this is really a wonderful guide to have on this journey. We talk about a variety of issues, such as how ancient climate changes explain the origins of humans, why the first humans were not the first tool makers, and why that really matters for the way that we understand the relationship between biology and technology, between evolution and innovation. Talk about the role of fire, fish, rocks, and eventually about ourselves, about Homo sapiens, about what, if anything, makes us unique as an animal, as an ape, as a hominin. There's a lot in this episode. If you struggle with any of the species, the names, technical terms, you can consult the show notes where I have a list and a short note explaining some of the big changes in the vocabulary of why, for example, you don't even hear Homo habilis mentioned in this conversation. In the show notes, you will also find links to the On Humans newsletter at onhumans.substack.com, where you can read more about relevant themes. I really hope that you enjoy this conversation. If you do, please do consider showing some support. For the long-term sustainability of the show, it's imperative that it keeps growing. You can help in that by sharing it with a friend, posting it online in some of your social medias, recommending it in any channels that you find relevant, or just subscribing if you have not done so yet. I really want to say thank you to all of those of you who support me on patreon.com/onhumans. If you do listen to On Humans regularly and appreciate the work that I do and want to show your support, please do consider joining the club of these wonderful people. And as a little perk, you will get a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter showing what's happening on my side and what's coming up with the show. So that's again patreon.com/onhumans. Thanks for considering, and I look forward to hearing from you. But let's get the show started. So without further ado, I bring to you Ian Tattersall. Dr. Ian Tattersall, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you.
North and South American continents didn't used to be together. There was ocean between, and then a bit over 2 million years ago, they merged.
Mm-hmm.
This had a lot of impact, and it had a lot of impact on the human journey. Why?
It did indeed, because when North and South America were separate, warm water could flow into the Atlantic from the Pacific and distribute heat across the face of the world in a very, very different way from what was possible when North and South America came together. There was no more hot water coming in from the Pacific, and the climate became dominated by the very cold circulation around Antarctica. And this had a major effect on terrestrial climatic cycles, including the Ice Age cycle with which we're so familiar.
And why is this relevant for the understanding of human origins?
Well, let me say, first of all, that in fact, I'm really happy you're situating all of this in the context of changing environments, because changing environments, external features, external events have had a lot of effect on human evolution. And it's very important to remember that evolution is not a process of optimization. Really, it's a process of getting along as best you can in the circumstances in which you find yourself. But in the Miocene 10, 12 million years ago, Africa was pretty much covered in forest. And the basic story is a story of a drying out of the environment, of a breakup of the formerly widely distributed forests, their replacement with woodlands and bushlands, and eventually with open savannas. And that is essentially the environmental background within which human beings evolved. And that's important because, of course, the story of human evolution is the story of a formerly tree-living ape, eventually coming to the ground, not immediately, but over several millions of years, distributing its behavior between the trees and the ground, and ultimately committing itself, maybe a couple of million years ago now, to an existence lived primarily on the ground, which was something that no ape had done before. And this particular ape accommodated by moving around on its hind limbs, thereby freeing its forelimbs for other things than locomotion, and making possible most of what happened thereafter.
So would it be too simplified to say that the apes that when a lot of these forest areas disappeared, and you get other more open forest habitats, or even savannas, the apes that stayed in the forest, they evolved to chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas. The apes that ventured out to the savannah, more or less, evolved to, well, us.
That's correct. So the Australopiths living in the period between about 4 to 5 million years ago and about
And still 3 million years ago, right? With the famous skeleton of Lucy.
the famous Lucy skeleton. Yes, she's 3.2 million years old, but she has close relatives, going back to over 4 million.
Okay.
The species Australopithecus anamensis came in, as far as we can tell, about 4.4 million years ago, and was already an upright biped, in the sense that it would have moved upright, we know, when it was on the ground. It has an ankle that is appropriate for weight bearing.
Okay. So the big picture is that we have these. We have already something which looks eerily something like between human and what might have been the common ancestor with chimpanzees. In these Australopithecines. Then we have a dramatic change in climates, largely caused by this joining of the Americas and everything. And once we have these climatic swings, we start having the first humans. Could you give a little bit of an idea of what kind of changes do we have when we take someone like Homo ergaster, the famous Turkana boy, another one of these famous fossils? Turkana boy is perhaps one of the first proper human fossils that we have, right? So what's the changes? How does the Turkana boy compare with Lucy, or more generally, how do the first humans compare to the last Australopithecines?
The Turkana boy is much taller and has body proportions which are not exactly like our own, but which are much more like our own than they're like those of Australopiths. And they're the body proportions of a hominin who's committed itself to a terrestrial environment. And when you commit yourself to a terrestrial habitat and you no longer shelter in the trees, of course, you are committing yourself to an environment in which there is a very high level of predation. And it must have been a very hazardous life for those small, those early bipeds out there on the savannah. There is also the beginning of an enlargement of the brain. Okay, so that the early Homo, as it's called, has a significantly larger brain than the Australopiths did. Australopiths already had a brain that was maybe 25% bigger than that of an ape, of a similar body size, but they weren't hugely brain. But then your early Homo has a significantly larger brain than that, and that might sound like a good thing, but if you've got a big brain, you have to feed it, and the brain is a very hungry tissue. So you have to find some dietary way of paying for this very large brain, and then that raises a lot of questions that we cannot immediately answer.
Yeah, I mean, there are people like Richard Wrangham who suggest that
Mhm.
really the only way to explain this increase in brain size is fire, because by cooking with fire we get many more nutrients out of especially meat, but also tubers, so like proto potatoes or whatever people
Yeah.
were eating then. Um, the problem there, I guess, is that we just don't really have good archaeological evidence of fire being used, at least regularly, this far back. Well, what do you think of Wrangham's argument, or more generally, the role of cooking in the origins of the early humans?
Yeah. I think that circumstantially, it's a very powerful argument. There must be some way of paying for brain, for a large brain, and the only obvious way of doing that under the circumstances would be to consume more animal fats and proteins. And animal fats and proteins are not terribly available foods. You know, a chimpanzee with a huge gut who eats, a monkey is going to excrete most of it undigested. The very first, modern proportioned hominids evidently had a much smaller gut.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because that's something that we can really see visually in the reconstructions of Australopithecines, for example, is that they have a more chimpanzee-like belly, whereas even the first humans, they start to be quite slim, right, compared. And so what happens is that the gut gets smaller. Gut is very expensive tissue, by the way. So this is one of the theories, right, that the guts get smaller, less expensive tissue there, but very expensive tissue in the brain. But then the question is, yeah, why can it get smaller? And so you're saying that you like Wrangham's basic argument.
Yeah, and one way you have of making such materials more digestible and less toxic, by the way. I mean, if you're out there on scavenging as well as hunting, you're going to have a lot of meat that's been invaded by a lot of bacteria and whatnot that can make it quite dangerous to eat. And cooking takes care of many of these problems. So if these guys actually did have the use of fire and were cooking their meat, it solves a lot of issues about how they were able to make a living and to grow their brains in the environment that they'd chosen. And it makes a lot of sense. The only problem is the lack of evidence. We really don't have any evidence directly for the use of fire before or the domestication of fire in an economic context before about 1 million years ago.
So the 1 million year before that, would we see it? Like, do you think it's more like where we just don't have any evidence to lean on, or do you see places as a paleoanthropologist where, look, here we probably would see some evidence, we just don't have it?
Well, Africa is a very big place, and it hasn't been terribly well explored yet. And it will be foolish to bet against any possibility basically. It would make a very good story, and it would be very satisfying if we were to find really good evidence from 1.5 million years ago, maybe it's 2 million years ago, that actually cooking was being done on maintained fires by early hominins. And I will be very happy if such evidence were to turn up. We just don't have it now, which doesn't mean that they weren't using fire as part of their adaptation, this extraordinary new lifestyle that they had adopted. It is a very unusual thing to become a secondary predator. Humans are predators today, although of course they're also prey. No, don't go messing around with grizzly bears and
Yeah.
so on. But we're basically predators, but we're very recent predators. Our initial adaptation, and early in the days of when all the other mammals were deciding what they were going to do. At the beginning of the age of mammals, all those possibilities were out there. Whales were going to become whales, and then shrews are going to become shrews, and everything was deciding what way of life it was going to adopt. And our ancestors adopted fruit eating, and we went then from being a committed fruit eater to being a committed omnivore. Partly through predation, and it's an extraordinary change in lifestyle there.
And some people say that it's one of the puzzling dilemmas in the human condition is that we have the anxiety and fear of a prey and the powers of a predator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, anything is possible in the human condition, and I'm sure we'll basically get there. But from the time being, there's no question about it. It's an extraordinary thing, coming from being a frugivore to being a predator in a remarkably short period of time. It was an extraordinary change. But in the early stages of that change, it meant being in a very, very vulnerable position, and fire would have helped there as well, because fire is a good way of discouraging attention from unwanted visitors.
Well, can I then suggest one alternative, which might be a compliment, might be an alternative, might be completely false. What about the idea that the early humans, powered their brain largely with animal fats, but especially marine animals, so fish, shellfish, things that are quite easy to digest without fire? Humans, there's been this whole, some people have pushed this idea so far that it became almost labeled as pseudoscience, the idea that humans are like an aquatic ape. And indeed, I think it can be pressed way too far, but in a kind of very moderate theory, this just suggests that humans used to live by lakes. We became very good swimmers, etc. This might have even helped with predation, because if you can swim away from the shore, if there's a big predator coming, and we know pretty much. Anybody who's into supplementation nowadays knows that omega-3 acids are amazing for the health of the nervous system. And so this could be one way to power that brain growth. What do you think about this kind of a semi-aquatic, water side human hypothesis?
Yeah, no, I think this is very important. The aquatic ape theory is taking a good idea to a crazy extreme, which is what human beings do with just about every good idea.
Yes.
And in this case, yes, I think the aquatic ape in its pure form is probably not leading us anywhere. But the idea that fish and marine resources and marine invertebrates, and so on, could have been the source of some, at least, or much of the nutrition that was necessary for doing what early hominids did, has been championed by some very reasonable and well-informed people. And I think that they probably are right. I mean, this is an obvious thing. Humans have always been tied to water. They may have left the trees and gone out in the savannah, but they did it by losing their hair and cooling themselves by the evaporation of sweat. When you regulate your body and particularly your brain temperature by the evaporation of sweat, you're committing yourself to having a lot of water available.
Yeah, yeah. You sweat a lot, so you need more to drink.
Humans are deeply dependent on water. They cannot live far away from a source of water. And of course, in a water source, you're going to have aquatic resources. Yeah. So this is all part of the picture, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, let's leave food aside. I mean, I guess food is super important because the most obvious things we see this change in size, change in brain size, change in gut. By the way, I guess change in teeth is also a big one. So the teeth get smaller, right, when we move to the early humans from Australopithecines.
Yeah, the teeth do get smaller. Certainly the chewing teeth get smaller. That's another argument for the use of fire as well, because of course fire makes food softer and yeah, is easier to chew.
But by the way, just on the earlier point, anyone who likes to eat sushi or oysters knows that they're also relatively easy to chew, even without being cooked.
Yeah,
compared to raw beef.
yeah, that kind of that's true too.
Okay, but let's leave the food aside and then focus on the very obvious question, which is how on earth do you survive on the savannah? You have all the big cats, etc. Some people make a big deal out of the fact that the shoulder structure, sorry, of the early humans is very different and much more suited for throwing. Really, no other mammal is quite good at throwing things as humans, as far as I can tell. Do you think that rock throwing played a big part in the way that humans survived the savannah?
Well, I think I think it probably did. We have no way of knowing. It's kind of like even harder to demonstrate than fire, right? Fire might at least hope to find physical evidence somewhere else. But whether, you know, if you've got an Australopith with a forwardly oriented shoulder joint, which would allow throwing of rocks, that means that rocks could have been thrown, but it's no proof.
Would the Australopithecines already be able to throw, or was it more the Homo ergaster, like
It's
Turkana boy, who were?
more we have as the Australopiths. There's a lot of argument, but certainly the Turkana boy, for example, right out there on the okay, did not have an upwardly oriented shoulder joint like an ape does, and it's not a suspensory creature, and he could have thrown. He could have thrown how accurately? Well, chimpanzees can throw quite accurately. They just can't throw that powerfully because
Yeah, which is quite important if you want to use it as a weapon.
lob. They have to lob like this, and so yeah, I'm sure that early hominids used everything that was available to them. If they had a shoulder that allowed them to throw it, they had rocks around to pick up there so they could throw them. They throw rocks, and you don't have to be that smart, I think, to figure that. And remember, these guys were already very good stone tool makers.
But actually, it's interesting that you mentioned stone tools, because one of the things that I was really surprised by when reading through your work was this idea that the way I had naively thought about human evolution for a long time is you get a new species and you get a new toolkit, for
Mm.
example. And it seems to be that the early humans, they used the same stone tools as the Australopithecines had already used. And more generally, you see these same stone tools used for like a million years before a new innovation comes up. And again, it's like a million years before. There's like only, even the early Homo sapiens, right, uses tools that would have been used like 500,000 years before them by other humans, and so it's really recent that you start having this rapid innovation of new tools. First of all, am I paraphrasing you correctly?
Spot on. Spot on.
And is there anything in the material lifestyle of the early humans that is really different from, say, Australopithecines? Because they are using the same tools. Do we see anything in the material evidence besides their skeletons themselves that makes them different?
This is such a good question, and it's so frustrating not to be able to give you a good answer to it. The earliest stone tools were definitely made at this point, definitely made by Australopiths. What difference they made in Australopiths' lives, we can't very much say. We know that they started butchering animals. How that fed back into their social lives, into their interior lives, into how they were processing information about the world, we don't know.
Well, let's then not look back from, for example, Homo ergaster, who, by the way, am I correctly that some people still call Turkana a Homo erectus rather than a Homo ergaster, just to make sure that people are kind of aware of the different terms out there?
Well, not if you ask me. If the Turkana boy, let's call him Homo ergaster.
Yeah.
Homo
But I
erectus.
guess some people have called him Homo erectus, right?
Oh, yeah.
Just so that we. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's a historical thing.
Yeah. We don't need to go into all the details. That's going to be another rabbit hole.
Homo erectus is a good species, but it's only known from Java and China.
Yeah. So Homo ergaster. Let's now we've done a fair amount of work comparing them to Australopithecines.
Mm-hmm.
Let's then look at how we get to, leaving the very peculiar things about maybe Homo sapiens aside. Let's take, for example, Homo neanderthalensis
Mm-hmm.
or Homo heidelbergensis, who I guess is the most common, the most recent common ancestor between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthal.
In a very general way. In a very general.
Well, it gets very messy. So let's simplify a messy picture and say that let's take some of the more recent hominids or very early Homo sapiens or something like that, and let's see what changes have happened from, say, Turkana boy, Homo ergaster, all the way to these most recent hominids. I mean, one obvious thing is that the brain keeps growing and growing, right?
Well, the brain, yes and no. The brain doesn't just keep growing and growing. It's interesting that there are three separate lineages within the genus Homo in which brains enlarged. There is the lineage leading to Homo erectus in the east of Asia. The earliest Homo erectuses had smaller brains than the later brains. The lineage leading to the Neanderthals, the earlier members have smaller brains than the later brains, and the lineage leading to Homo sapiens. The earliest ones had smaller brains, and the later ones had bigger brains. So there is a tendency to brain enlargement independently in three lineages within the genus Homo. If you look at the details, then you get stuck a little bit because it's not a constant enlargement. The oldest have larger brains, the youngest have smaller brains, but in the middle, you got a bit of a mess. It's a messy picture, and you're not looking at a really graduated kind of a situation here.
Okay, well, let's take this bumpy, non-linear, but nevertheless progression from Australopithecines have a brain size maybe 20, you said 25% larger than chimpanzees. Turkana boy, would it be like roughly double or even over double the size of chimpanzees?
Yeah, your average chimpanzee would have a 350, maybe 400 cubic centimeter brain. Your average Australopith would have maybe 400, maybe 450 centimeter brain, and your Turkana boy is 880.
880. Okay. Okay.
Most,
So it's quite a jump.
yeah, it's
And we are 1,300 or?
we're 1,300 thereabouts, but
Yeah.
during the Pleistocene, Homo sapiens was averaged 1,500, which was the same
Yeah.
size as a Neanderthal brain.
And now it's a bit smaller.
So years ago, we had brains the same size of Neanderthals, about 13% bigger than our brains average today.
And when does the diminished brain size, when does it happen? When does it start happening? Is there an inflection point or is it quite gradual?
Well, we don't have a lot uh, of skulls to help us tell that, but really,
Okay.
since the end of the last ice age,
Yeah.
um, our
So
brain
12,000 years ago or so.
well, 10, say over the last 10, 15, max 20,000 years, our
Okay, so very recently. Okay.
smaller,
Okay. Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's for the last 10,000 years.
And we need to get there. We're very much approaching this the mysterious journey of Homo sapiens. But before we get there, is there anything that people should understand about this messy path from Homo ergaster to Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis? Is it just that the same things that were happening already just become more and more? For example, the brain size increase continues, the ape-like features slowly become less and less. Is it just a kind of you can extrapolate from the move from Australopithecines to Homo ergaster? You could extrapolate pretty much what either Homo sapiens or Homo neanderthalensis would look like, or is there something that's quite striking that people should understand about that development?
We don't know much about Homo ergaster. We know that Homo ergaster comes on the scene, and it's hard. It's really hard to tell exactly when, but I think it's reasonable to surmise that the first Homo ergaster were making simple Oldwin style flake tools the same way that their predecessors had been making them for a million and a half years.
Yeah.
You know,
So
by
on the record, the first humans did not make new kinds of tools.
right. The first genus Homo did not make a new kind of tool. Pretty sure about that. But by about 1.6, maybe a little million years ago, maybe a little longer than that, they were already making the Acheulean hand axe type tools, which is the first tool to be shaped on both sides to a particular shape. The earliest tools had just been about getting a cutting edge. The tool makers wanted something that would cut. They didn't care what it looked like, but they did care what their hand axes looked like. They were made to a standard sort of teardrop shape. So something else very different was going on in the mind of a toolmaker making hand axes, and was going on in the mind.
There was like a model of the future product that they're trying to get to.
That's right. There was a mental template in there.
Please ignore this question if this becomes really complicated and technical and we're going to lose all the listeners. But do we know which species made the first hand axes?
Let's say Homo ergaster.
Okay.
Yeah, the Turkana The Turkana is about 1.6. That's about exactly the same time that we begin to get routine production of hand axes.
And then it takes another million years, right, roughly, towards the next big innovation in tool making.
Hand axe making became more refined over time, but the concept remained the same. And it's only at, well, you know, again, with sort of outliers, but it's only at around 400,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more, that you begin to get the next conceptual refinement in stone tool making, which was to shape a good quality piece of stone. You can't do this with just any old piece of rock. To take a good quality, predictably fracturing piece of stone and to shape it on both sides until you could, with one final blow, detach a finished tool.
Okay.
And you throw the blank away, but you would have a finished tool with a cutting edge all around it. That could then be reshaped, or you could maybe get a few more of them off the same blank as well. But this was an entirely new concept that led in the end to the making of blades and whatnot, which was typical of the Cro-Magnons, but it took a while to get there.
But this was not Homo sapiens who first invented this tool, right?
No, this came in with Homo heidelbergensis.
Okay, okay. Who might maybe be the last common ancestor with Neanderthals and us.
Yeah, this remains to be sorted out in the future. I think it's useful to have a concept of Homo heidelbergensis as appearing. It appears in Africa and Europe at about 600,000 years ago. A little bit, a bit out of nowhere, but soon it's taken over the world. It's taken over all the old world, basically, that was inhabited by hominids at the time. And it started inventing all kinds of things, hafting of tools, of stone tool in a wooden or a bone handle. The first wooden spears, throwing spears we have, come from that time. The first shelters that we have any evidence of comes from that. So here you got a smart hominid that is doing all kind of neat things that nobody ever did before. But what it didn't produce apparently was symbolic objects.
So all the tools were useful.
Strictly functional, yeah. Strictly functional.
Okay. Let's get to symbolic in just a moment, because I think that's really what's gonna, in some sense, define the story of our species. Before that, though, one question about this long progression from Homo ergaster to Homo heidelbergensis and eventually to Neanderthals and us. This is a period of increasing brain size. The way that the brain grows, correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much means that you need to have longer and longer childhoods and more difficult births. All of this calls for increased care, extra maternal care for the offspring, and help during the childbirth. Do you think that it's a gradual process that we start getting more and more, whether it's the support of the other parent or of the community? There are people like Sarah Hrdy who make a big case about so-called allo parenting, so not genetically related parents. Do you think that this is something that really comes on stage with this brain growth during the journey of these different Homo species? Do you think Australopithecines already had it? Or what do you think about this childcare aspect of the human story?
Well, certainly there's a strong correlation between all these things in our lineage. And yes, I think there was really a strong obstetric component in there too, because as brains got bigger, birth got trickier. And particularly in a biped, in which the size of the birth canal is strictly limited. So yeah, all these things somehow go together.
Yeah, so I guess leaving aside, I mean, monogamy is a horribly loaded term with a lot of different meanings. But let's just say pair bonding. It's quite clear that humans form pair bonds, so that where they have long-term, strong emotional relationship between mating partners, similar in other pair bonding species that you don't see in chimpanzees, in bonobos, in gorillas. Do you have any guess when were the first lovers out there?
Well, you find pair bonding in many species of primate. The bonded pairs don't turn out to be the parents of the offspring
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Hence, I don't want to use the term monogamy, but
pair bonding is not unique to humans. But I think the thing that
but it is in the apes, right? It is in the apes, right?
well, it is in gibbons. They're the
Oh, really? Okay. But so assuming that the common ancestor with chimpanzees and humans was not pair bonding, but was probably a significantly more casual. When do you think that the first pair bonds emerged in the human journey, in the human lineage?
This is a really, really good question, and I don't have a good answer to it. The thing about it is that pair bonding, as we understand it, is mediated by the particular way in which we process our experience in our minds. And I think we're unique in that. So what I could say is, even if there was pair bonding earlier on in human evolution than the arrival of fully symbolic Homo sapiens, it would not have meant the same thing to its participants.
Okay, yeah. Just to wrap up the earlier point, I guess that the idea there was that pair bonding could be one explanation. One explanation for the emergence of it could be the increased need for extra maternal childcare. But anyway, let's leave that aside. You've mentioned many times the word symbolic. What does it mean?
Oh dear. I think that symbolic is a shorthand term for something that we do not fully understand about the way that we process information in our minds.
We Homo sapiens.
What we seem to do, and I think it's uniquely, is to deconstruct the environment around us into a vocabulary of mental symbols. And we put our world together by assembling those symbols. And we can recombine them. Once they're disassembled and in our mind, we can recombine those new symbols mentally and ask questions like, what if? I think other animals live in a more holistic world, which is not disassembled into this discrete vocabulary in the way in which we do. And because the world is holistic, they can take elements of it and shuffle them around and come up with new versions of the world. And I think this symbolic quality of our experience, our ability to decompose everything into a bunch of units that can be recombined, is A, what I call symbolism, and B, it's the fount of our originality, our imagination, our inventivity. You mentioned earlier that hominids didn't make new kinds of tools for millions of years. They'd make the same old tool for millions and millions of years. And today, we're changing our technologies, all the time. And I think this has to do with the fact that they were not symbolic and we are.
I think that there's a lot of people who might intuitively agree with you, but because there are people who certainly won't, some people will say that no, other animals are perfectly able to do that. Giving an answer to them, I think, or one answer lies in the fact that you're not saying this just based on your intuition, right? You're saying this because you say that there is an inflection point in the archaeological record that has to be explained, that there is a moment before which things look relatively similar, and there's a moment after which everything suddenly changes. First of all, am I right? And if I'm right, when is that point?
Well, the other thing is that I am using the word say. I'm saying it using language, right? And as language is the ultimate symbolic activity.
But language doesn't fossilize, is the problem.
No, it doesn't. But we'll get to that in a moment. But, the fact is that we have language, and as far as we know, nothing else does. But language is literally, it's the poster child for symbolism, because what is language but the creation of a vocabulary of symbols spoken in this case, and their reassembly into statements. And that's where we get our discrete infinity. You can have a limited number of words and say an unlimited number of different things using them. Now, as you say, language doesn't preserve. There's no way in which directly impacts the archaeological record. It doesn't even directly impact the physical record either. But language is a product of our symbolic ability. And our symbolic ability expresses itself in other ways too. For example, in the production of symbolic, that is to say, non-functional objects, things like cave art, things like small carvings, things like incisions on ochre plaques. That kind of thing is symbolic too.
And when do we start seeing symbolic, not just functional artifacts in the archaeological record?
Well, you have a little bit of a definitional issue here with such things as shell beads and whatnot that may or may not be symbolic. But what you can confidently say that basically before 100,000 years ago, there's nothing much that you would want to regard as symbolic. After 100,000 years ago, or a little less, it's everywhere, or it's rapidly everywhere.
And interestingly, that's much more recent than the origins of our species. I know the exact date of the origins of Homo sapiens goes from something like 300,000 to 200,000, depending on who you ask. But certainly it's not 100,000. So
Yeah, if you ask me, it is not 300,000 yet, but it's getting close. 230,000 is the earliest that we have fossils that suggest that Homo sapiens was around.
and so 100,000 years, nothing symbolic.
Basically, there are a few straws in the wind, we could say, but there's nothing to suggest that symbolism was a routine possession of any population, whether it be of early Homo sapiens or Neanderthal or whatever, until well after 100,000 years ago.
Yeah. Well, before we ask the question, why did it happen? Which I think is probably the big mystery in understanding our species, according to your way of looking at our species.
Yeah.
There are people who say that the recent discoveries have changed this picture. We have discovered Neanderthal art. Neanderthals were symbolic creatures too. What do you think of that?
There are occasional indications that a Neanderthal did something which a later Homo sapiens might have done. But there is no indication that behaviors of that kind were ever a pervasive quality of any Neanderthal society. Yet once Homo sapiens has started doing it, it very rapidly becomes a central focus of social products. And that tells me something. Yeah, I'm the last to deny that Neanderthals were very smart, and that occasionally a very smart Neanderthal may have done something that in another context might have been attributed to Homo sapiens. I think that Neanderthals were really smart, but I don't think Neanderthals are smart in the way that we are, and I don't think that symbolism was a regular part of their social repertoire, ever. The occasional expression, a little bit of paint on a cave wall, I don't think tells you that Neanderthals had a symbolic repertoire.
Well, why did it happen? So that's the big question then.
My inclination is to believe that that the capacity for symbolic behavior obviously must have been there before the behavior itself, because this is how things have to happen in evolution. Evolution doesn't drive novelties into existence. Novelties come randomly into existence, and then they're recruited by evolution. That's you could think about, say, the origin of flight in birds.
Yes.
Birds had feathers for many, many, many millions of years before they ever used them to fly. But they could never have flown without them. They could never have been fly without them. This is very, very typical of the history of innovations in evolution. The capacity appears, and at some point it has to be recruited. Obviously, to have symbolic thought, to have language, Homo sapiens has to have had the basic mental equipment. And that basic mental equipment must have come into existence independently of what it was later used for. And I'm suggesting that the only obvious place that we could have acquired the abilities that we have later capitalized upon to manipulate information in our unique way, they must have been acquired at the moment when human beings acquired their extraordinary new anatomy. Homo sapiens is very different from even its closest relatives. Not only is it lighter built, but it has this strange structure of the skull, whereby we have a huge balloon-like skull with a very high forehead and a tiny face that is moved, rotated underneath.
Is this why when children draw faces before their art teacher tells them to put the eyes right in the center of the face, the faces look quite ape-like or somehow non-Homo sapiens-like?
Yeah, but children are key in our story here, I think, because the ability must have come, I think, at that moment, which included, by the way, the retraction of the face below the brain case is what forced the larynx down, giving us the ability to form in our upper vocal tract the sounds that we use to project speech, to externalize.
Interesting. So it was kind of a byproduct of this more general shift of cranial morphology or whatever we want to call it.
I think it was. So we got all these features, and I think and as far as we know from the record, Homo sapiens as an anatomically recognizable entity like ourselves was around for quite a long time before it started producing symbolic objects. And the ability to think symbolically, I think, must have been recruited by some kind of cultural stimulus. The biology had to be there, or the behavior couldn't have been adopted. And so we have to ask what that biological stimulus was, or that the cultural stimulus was. And my candidate is the invention of a language, because language is the ultimate symbolic activity. Like I said, before, it involved the deconstruction of the world around you into that vocabulary of symbols. And you could just see how the attachment of meaning to sounds, of specific meanings, particulate meanings to sounds, and to multiple sounds, and the association of these sounds could have started a feedback loop in the brain involving these newly connected areas of brain that had been adventitiously acquired in the origin of the anatomical species Homo sapiens. And this is so radical. This is such a radical thing that it could only, I think, have been done by children. I cannot imagine adults inventing language. Adults invent lots of things, but they've never invented anything, I think, as radical as language. And I could just see in some little place in Africa, a small isolate of hominids, early Homo sapiens, with the kids running around and using their hands to communicate and using sounds to communicate in the old ways that their parents did, and suddenly attaching meaning to sounds and starting this feedback happening in their brains and starting to talk. And we've seen this happen in obviously everybody has all populations have spoken language already, but we've seen it in the spontaneous invention of sign language by children who
By deaf children, yeah.
by deaf children who otherwise didn't have any way of knowing that things had names.
But hold on a second. That could be. I think that's a really interesting point, but it could be used as a counter argument, I believe, because if I understand right, the story you're telling is one where biological evolution creates Homo sapiens, which now is able, for whatever reason, to do this kind of symbolic activity in a way that a lizard is not able to do, or presumably other hominids were not able to do.
Mm-hmm.
But what really changes things around 100,000 years ago is not a genetic mutation, is not something in the biological evolution. It's something that just suddenly is kind of discovered. But here comes the counter argument: is that if you take humans in the genetic makeup, biological makeup that we are today, and you put children together, even if they don't have language, they seem to generate it really fast. They seem to generate it in a couple of years, not in 100,000 years, which could suggest that these children are born today with a kind of a biology which is really well inclined to create a language and a symbolic culture more generally immediately. And therefore, we would suggest that that wasn't the case in the early Homo sapiens because they went around over 100,000 years without doing anything like that.
Yeah, but remember, the children today who invent sign languages live in a linguistic world which is pre-divided for them into objects that have descriptors. So if you're born into a world where this is not done, I don't think it's. In fact, I think it happened quite fast that this discovery was made. And the key to me is that language maps pretty much perfectly onto symbolic thought. And we know the language was invented. We know that we are descended from a non-linguistic ancestor. And so once the cat was out of the bag, boom, everybody was predisposed, already had the Homo sapiens brain. Everybody was predisposed to acquire language once it was invented, and it spread like wildfire. And pretty soon, Homo sapiens is out of Africa and taking over the world. And how else do we explain this?
Yeah, in one of your books, you give a really, I think, striking image of what it might have been like for the species to have this symbolic wake up. You talk about a linguist called Susan Schaller, who has a book called A Man Without Words.
That's right. Yep.
Who studied this man called what was his name? Ildefonso?
Ildefonso, yes.
Ildefonso, yeah, who is dead and has lived in a speaking household, and according to Susan Schaller, has not realized that things have words. So is in a sense living, as far as I understand what you're suggesting, in a kind of pre-symbolic being with the same biology, but not with this new cultural innovation that has spread like wildfire. And when he does realize that things have names, I have a couple of quotes from Susan Schaller. So, quote, "Suddenly he sat up straight and rigid. The whites of his eyes expanded as if in terror. He broke through. He had entered the universe of humanity, discovered the communion of minds."
Right. Yeah, I quote that in Masters of the Planet because it's powerful, so powerful. Yes.
Yeah. So this is your vision is not a gradual improvement from rudimentary signing and gesturing and vocalizing, but rather as kind of abrupt
Yeah.
waking up to a new cultural reality.
I don't suggest that it just came out of nowhere. It came out of something very complex that preceded it, including body language was very obviously very important, still is. Gestural language is very important, obviously, still is. Vocal communication, our predecessor was, even without being linguistic, I think was pretty sophisticated. It's the coming together of all of these elements.
The image you're giving is one where, just as we see that brain growth, species change, these are biological things that are happening in their course, and new tools are quite separate. They just kind of come up, and there's nothing in the bones, nothing in the fossils that we can really pinpoint. Oh, look, this changed, and now they are able to use a new tool. No, they just discover a new tool, and this is the kind of model that you use here for this cultural new way of being, if I'm right. Another way to look at the issue, I think, to challenge the story would be to say that symbolic thinking is not novel, because we do see something like symbolic thinking even in, say, chimpanzees. So, for example, it's very common. It used to be common to say that humans were the first tool makers, but when then we realized that chimpanzees also do make tools, and this was the famous discovery by Jane Goodall, they do modify objects to fish for termites. So what was novel was humans were making tools that fossilize. Now, in the same way, you could say that there's, as I remember seeing this really, really funny photographic essay on how one, I think it was a chimpanzee, might have been a bonobo or a gorilla, who starts wearing a straw on their ear as a kind of decoration. And suddenly this spreads across the population.
They're all
doing it, exactly. Well, here we have body decorations, symbolic in a sense, body decorations, which don't fossilize. And so, what do you think about someone who would push back by saying that I don't think that there was a sudden leap of symbolic culture? I think that it's been there all along. What happened was just suddenly we started making symbolic stuff out of things that fossilize. And so it wasn't really that radical of a leap.
I think I think chimpanzees are very smart, but they're not smart in the way that we are. And we're the ones that are making them extinct. They're not the ones that are making us extinct. We're the ones putting them in cages. They're not the ones putting us in cages. I mean, there is a difference that we're looking at in Homo sapiens, and it expresses itself most clearly in language. And apes don't have language, and we do. And yes, apes can recognize symbols. They could even create vocabularies as symbols, but they seem to manipulate them additively. You can do something, say something, like take red ball outside. That's four concepts, and they can get it. But when you keep on adding concept to concept, you lose track very quickly. And language is infinitely flexible, and the manipulation of symbols in our brain, in the way we do it, is infinitely flexible. And that's not what chimpanzees are doing.
You've written a really wonderful book called Masters of the Planet about human origins.
Hate the title. I want to go on record. Hate the title.
So it was an editor's choice.
Yes.
Okay, let's put that on the record. By far the most famous book that has anything to do with human origins that I think is still on the bestseller list of nonfiction books after over 10 years is Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*. And in *Sapiens*, Harari makes a really big deal about, I think he would probably agree with you quite a lot, because he doesn't use the word symbolic culture, but he talks about the human capacity to believe in fictions. And he uses the word fiction very broadly. So if I can quote from one of his early chapters, he is interested in how can humans cooperate with such large groups as we can. And he says, quote, "How did Homo sapiens manage to cross this critical threshold, eventually founding cities comprising tens of thousands of inhabitants and empires ruling hundreds of millions? The secret was probably the appearance of fiction." And then he goes on to say that any large human cooperation is rooted in common myths that exist only in people's collective imagination. Churches are rooted in common religious myths. Two Catholics who have never met can nevertheless go together, crusade, or pool funds to build a hospital because they both believe that God was incarnated in human flesh and allowed himself to be crucified to redeem our sins. States are rooted in common national myths. Two Serbs who have never met might risk their lives to save one another because both believe in the existence of the Serbian nation, the Serbian homeland, and the Serbian flag. And finally, judicial systems are rooted in common legal myths. Two lawyers who have never met can nevertheless combine efforts to defend a complete stranger because they both believe in the existence of laws, justice, human rights, and the money paid out in fees. Yet none of these things exist outside the stories that people invent and tell one another, unquote.
Yeah.
I feel a lot of resonance between what Harari is saying and what you're saying. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that's absolutely correct. Everything he's saying there. The thing is, he's describing a symptom rather than the underlying capacity. To me, what's interesting is the underlying capacity, that ability to make associations in the mind that makes it possible to have language, which makes it possible to make up stories. We are storytelling creatures. In fact, everything that we know about the world that we tell ourselves is a story, and that makes us different from, I think, from other organisms, even very complicated organisms out there, because they are not telling a story about the world, they are experiencing the world as it presents itself to them. And so, yeah, this is all very important about it's only one reflection of something deeper. And that deep thing is that ability to make associations in the mind.
And that deeper thing is reflected in all the cave art, in all the decorations that you suddenly start seeing, in the non-useful things that you start seeing in the fossil record.
And on all the crazy things as well. You know, all the wonderful things about Homo sapiens, all the appalling things about Homo sapiens, you know, basically traceable back to this, to the same thing.
Well, final question before we finish. How has all the research that you've done shaped your outlook on humanity?
Well, what I think it has done is to teach me why we human beings are such incredibly capricious creatures. Because, you know, for all the philosophical hand-wringing that has been done on the subject over the millennia, it turns out that there really is no specifiable human condition. Because, you know, for all the philosophical hand-wringing our species as a whole, you can really only describe it by the normal distribution, in a sense. So for every saint, you can find a sinner. For every philanthropist, you know, you can find a miser. And sometimes in the very same person. You go on and on and on. Homo sapiens is a bundle of contradictions. And what this tells me is that we've not been fine-tuned by evolution to be any particular kind of a creature. As individuals, this is actually rather encouraging because the upside of this paradoxical nature of ours is that we do have free will. We are able to make choices. And that, of course, brings with it a lot of responsibility because within social and practical limits, every one of us is free to be the kind of creature we want to be. And that, I think, is unique to Homo sapiens. That's the basic message of all this. We are an emergent creature with emergent qualities, one of which is choice. And with choice goes responsibility, which is something that gets forgotten sometimes.
Dr. Ian Tattersall, thank you so much for a really clarifying and exciting journey today and all your research.
Well, it's been fun talking to you. Thanks so much.
So that was it for today. If you want to continue with the topic, there's plenty of episodes on human evolution. Number 6, number 21, especially number 23 with Jeremy De Silva are great places to continue. And if you do like the show indeed, please do rate it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows. Do mention it on social media and do consider becoming a supporter at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much for considering. Until next time, take care.